Andy asked me to introduce Lisa. I, of course, was trying to think about what I could say, and I was at a coffee shop the other day, and I saw a quote on the wall, and in my mind, it really typifies Lisa. And it's actually something that Janis Joplin said. Janis, who in my mind is not unlike Lisa. She said, "Don't compromise yourself. You're all you've got." And I really feel that tells us who Lisa is and what she's about. Lisa has never compromised herself. She's always stayed true to herself and to her beliefs. She brings depth, integrity, and intelligence to her work. Currently, Lisa is the professor of art at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. She's been there for 9 years. And one of the numerous awards, I did not want you to sit here the whole time while I listed off the awards. One of the numerous awards that she's received is the Lewis Comfort Tiffany Foundation Grant, which is an enormous honor. Her work is in too many collections. I'm not going to tell you all of them. I'm going to tell you 3. She's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, to name a few. And this is the best news. She will be having an exhibition at the Bellevue Art Museum that opens in March. The title is The Gold Standard, and I'll expect to see you all at the opening. Lisa Gralnick.
Years ago, when I first met the man who would later become my husband, and then my ex-husband, I was compelled to make him a gift. On our first meeting, I had been rendered almost paralyzed by the beauty of his feet, long and sinewy and sprouting from the most delicate ankles, and I imagined those sandaled feet in a near-biblical context. Within a few weeks and without hesitation, I began fashioning a golden shackle for my lover's ankle, and he in turn demanded it be made without a clasp, the final hinge links permanently riveted together as he lay prostrate on my studio floor, foot propped up on my anvil as I hammered it closed, quietly eager to feel the daily constraint of this new encumbrance. After a brief period of wearing the all-too-snug-fitting gold shackle, he announced that it had broken while running and deposited the disjointed parts in my studio for repair, where they lay for months into years. It seemed that its moment had passed, along with the blush that had prompted its making, and one night, in a fit of anger over this or that, and without remorse, I dumped it into a crucible and reduced it to an anonymous fiery mass of molten metal. I'm going to do a real brief review of my early work, and then just kind of a little small collection from each body of work. I've actually gone through quite a few distinct bodies of work in my career. I've been out there. It's actually 30 years this year since I finished graduate school, so I've been out there working a long time. The first body of work started in the mid 1980s, about 7 or 8 years after I finished graduate school, and that was my work in black acrylic. By the way, if you're wondering about the foot that I showed on the first slide, I'll tell you. When I first met the man that was later to become my husband, he wooed me after I confessed that his feet made me weak in the knees. He wooed me by sending me a plaster cast of his foot in the mail. No note attached. So in the mid-1980s, I spent, I guess, about 7 or 8 years working totally in black acrylic. I had been working in precious materials in grad school and in in the first, say, 5 or 6 years after grad school, and then all of a sudden I just put the gold and silver and enamel aside, and I wanted to work in a anonymous, urbane material, something that nobody would even recognize as a material, and I wanted to sort of explore jewelry from a different point of view, and I worked on this black acrylic work. On the left slide there is the rubber house, which is a house made out of black rubber, which I discovered on a country road in upstate New York. And I used to drive my car and sit in my car in front of it and drink a coffee and eat a buttered roll and just wonder what the heck it was. And everyone in my life thought that I made it up when I talk about the rubber house. But in fact, the rubber house does exist. Next slide. I don't have a clicker, so let's just go through these black pieces kind of fast. So the pieces sort of evolved into more of these kind of sort of post-industrial fragments. They were large wearable pieces of jewelry, all fabricated out of 1/16 inch acrylic sheet. Some of my favorite of the black pieces were the black bracelets. I liked them because they, number one, were fully in the round, so there didn't have to be any pin back, and number two, I kind of designed a way that they could go on that had a completely hidden mechanism. It was a gold slide and click mechanism that was in the inside of the bracelet. And three, when people got them on, they couldn't figure out how to get them off. And one woman still wears hers, and I occasionally get a late night call from her husband after she's worn it to a museum opening or a cocktail party, and she has a panic attack about how to get it off, and I have to walk them through it again. And I sort of loved that idea that this black jewelry actually victimized its wearers. One of the things that has been interesting to me throughout my entire career and throughout all my bodies of work has been the notion of economy and efficacy in terms of the making of a statement. How few things do you actually need to conceptually achieve what you want to achieve in a work of art? And I collect patent models. These are U.S. patent models, and I actually use them in my teaching as examples of perfect manifestations of an idea realized in form. These are mid-19th century patent models. The U.S. Patent Office used to require that you actually build a no more than 12-inch by 12-inch by 12-inch model of an invention in order to get a patent. And I started at a certain point collecting them. The one on the left is the original patent model for box spring mattress, and the one on the right is for an early hot water heater. And these to me these were not made by artists, they were simply made by somebody that had an idea and had to, as quickly and efficiently as they could, and cheaply usually, express that idea. That idea of efficacy got me into a body of work that I worked on for a number of years that were these mechanical pieces, and they really were, in a way, kind of a conceit. I was studying physics. I always have had an interest in theoretical physics, and when I can, luckily right now I'm at one of the greatest universities for theoretical physics around, but before that I used to have to actually go somewhere else to take a class. So these pieces, this whole body of work was sort of about the simple idea of building a mechanism and the mechanism actually being the piece, and that there should not be anything on the piece that was not related to its working as a primitive machine. So all these pieces did was wind up a gold weight up and down, and you could unwind it, drag it behind you, or you could wind it and wear it really short. But they were a folly. What they did wasn't that important, and what was more important to me was getting the thing to do this perfect task smoothly and efficiently. More of those kind of pieces. These were spools where the chain actually wound up inside. One of the things that has also been interesting to me Although I have to confess, as I get older, it's less interesting, and that is the notion of beauty. I thought a lot about beauty over the years. I read a lot about beauty. The closest I have come at any point to understanding what beauty is that it is indeed a phenomenological event. It is something that you can't own, you can't covet, you can't reproduce. It's simply a set of circumstances at a given moment in time that you can only appreciate from afar, not unlike the fact that you can see blue water from afar, but you can never pour yourself a glass of blue water. Okay, so there is the glass of blue water and the glass of clear water, and I always like to say that this could very possibly be the best work of art I've ever made. It certainly is the most efficacious, if you can say that. It didn't require any making whatsoever. But it's also a slide that talks about other things that I've been interested in. One of which is the phenomenology of the art object in general, and whether or not the late 20th century idea of artistic intent being the most important thing about an art object is indeed true, or if, as we as metalsmiths suppose, there actually is some integrity to the object itself, separate from what our intent is, and there is some reason why we spend months working on one piece. And this is actually an idea that has kind of developed into new ways of thinking for me over the years. I did a body of work that lasted about probably 6 or 7 years of these reliquary necklaces. There were, all in all, I think about 30 of them. And we just have a few here. And these were kind of a very poetic body of work for me after doing these very minimal, reduced kind of pieces. Then all of a sudden I started doing this very poetic, supercharged body of work. And I think that I was interested in pushing the boundaries of that sort of idea of the pound of flesh in the work of art, how much personal stuff I could squeeze in there and somebody would actually still be interested in owning it and wearing it. And so this one is called Green Torment, Pink Death. Grand Illusion has a group of 4 finger rings that pull out. One has carbon in it, one has fingernails in it, one has hair in it, and one has gold in it, the 4 things that survive after the body decomposes. And then there is, on the right-hand side, the gold braid, which for me became a kind of symbol of the grand illusion, the idea that this all has some importance. Phenomenological Oddity is the name of this piece, and it's just a plain old cube hanging on a chain, and there's a little vial of my blood in there, and on the left-hand side there is an alphabet cut out of a $1 bill. And a $1 bill has every letter in the alphabet except a Q, and I made a fake Q by taking an O and a hand putting a little doodad on it. The last of this group, Beauty and the Theory of Relativity, and here is actually the blue water that I talked about earlier. So I kind of ended this body of work with the blue water in there. And this was a part of this investigation I was making into trying to understand beauty and trying to see it kind of as a window through which you could enter other things. So beauty really wasn't what you were after. You were using beauty to enter into other kinds of understanding and meaning. And there, of course, is the theory of relativity on the inside, E equals mc squared. And just this incredibly cliched image of beauty, this sort of Greek urn with the flower, the rose winding around it. Then I moved into these folded pieces, very, very thin gold. One of the things that has always been interesting to me. I play the violin, and I'm really interested in music, and I'm really interested in mathematics, which it's not uncommon for mathematics and music to be interests that one person holds together, since they're both so intimately related. And so this body of work really came out of an interest in building some pieces out of very, very thin gold, trying to capture the sort of temporality of the paper models that I would always require my students to make. I wanted the pieces to have that kind of freshness, and not the sort of overworked version that you'd actually see in the piece after they finished it, but the fresh version that you'd see in the paper model. And then I was sort of exploring the idea of the possibility of working within a very defined structure and then seeing that structure deteriorate. And I had a kind of aha moment when all of a sudden I realized, after years of asking my violin teacher, how come the Bach Concerto in A minor is called the Bach Concerto in A minor when most of the piece, it diverts from the key of A minor. And my teacher gave me the simple answer, which was, all it has to do is start in A minor and end in A minor to be called the Bach Concerto in A minor. And thus I realized that the absolute beauty and thrill and romanticism of music was actually in the way that that piece moved away from the structure over a course of time and then came back to it. It actually imploded from within. So that was what I was sort of after in this whole body of brooches. And I was working on these up until the time I moved to Madison 9 years ago. And actually I worked on the last of these my first year in Madison. Then I started on this body of work, the gold standard, and one of the things that sort of drew me to starting on this body of work, which is what I'm still working on now and what I'm going to be showing at the Bellevue, was first and foremost the notion of gold as a signifier, that actually we see so much gold in our everyday life in terms of gold-plated CDs and gold-plated razor blades and gold wrappers on chocolates and gold wrappers on bottles of champagne and balsamic vinegar and makeup cases, that most people, if you were to say gold, that's what they imagine, and they don't even really see the look of real gold. They recognize gold now as the signifier of gold, and I found that rather interesting. Then I became... These two slides, they're in cahoots with one another for some reason. Then I became just kind of interested in the recyclability of gold, the idea that this was, in a way, this kind of eternally recurring material that you could forever make pieces out of gold. I actually fantasized that you could actually send a whole portfolio of gold work, say to a gallery or an exhibition, and just have bought one little piece of gold and just keep making a piece, melting it down, photographing it, melting it down, making another one, photographing it, and melting it down. And finally, over the last 2 years, I really have become extremely interested in the history of works of art, especially seen through the eyes of scholars in the early Christian and medieval period, and writings on object making and image making from the iconoclastic debates. And we got to go back now. What you're seeing here now is my violin, but it's not actually my violin anymore because I got a new violin, and a plaster cast of a violin. And I want to just read you something from the 9th century, written by Theodore of Studion. And this was what I'm going to read you. The short quote is a quote, a passage that was written relative to the discussion about making religious icons, and of course, most of the history of Western art is rooted in these discussions about the making of icons that happened in the early Christian period. So I think it's really important to understand what was going on. And if any of you have ever read Michael Fried's seminal essay, Art and Objecthood, you might want to read it again and think about it in terms of the iconoclastic debates, because it's a very, very interesting discussion about the difference between art and an object. But anyways, look at those two images and listen to this. The prototype and the image, the prototype being the violin, the image being the image of the violin. The prototype and the image belong to the category of related things like the double and the half. For the prototype always implies the image of which it is the prototype, and the double always implies the half in relationship to which it is called double. For there would not be a prototype if there were no image. There would not even be any double if some half were not understood. But since these things exist simultaneously, they are understood and subsist together. Therefore, since no time intervenes between them, one does not have a different veneration from the other, but both have one and the same. This became very interesting to me. Of course, in the light of the iconoclastic debates, what they were saying was it's okay to make images of Christ or images of God because we wouldn't have a notion of Christ and of God if we didn't have an image. And that the two things, it's impossible to separate the two things. And this became a very important part of the debate. But it's a sort of larger question, since we know that most of the history of art has been in mimesis, the early history of art, in painting, landscapes, and portraits. And if we see all of contemporary art as some sort of version of a prototype and an image, it becomes interesting to think of what other kinds of combinations there could be in terms of prototypes and images. And one of the things that began to occur to me was the notion that I could look at that violin and I could look at a painting of it or a plaster casting of it, and I could easily understand it as a prototype and an image. Now, what if I imagined that violin in a whole other way? I imagined that violin as a quantity of gold. And so I started thinking about everyday things that we give certain values to, commodities, and imagining those commodities as a value in gold, which is precisely what I did. I started making castings of actual things. I would make polyurethane rubber molds, and then I would make plaster castings from them. I would find out the exact value of that object on a given day. In this case, it was a 1950s Kohler bar sink that's in my downstairs bathroom in my house. I took it off the wall, molded it, and made a casting of it. And then I went on the computer and I looked for what it would cost to buy this exact sink right now, even though it's not made anymore. I took that amount, and then I took the value of gold on that day, and I fabricated a section of the sink in gold to correspond to its value on that day. And all of the Part 1 pieces in the gold standard were done with this methodology. The gold standard project actually has 3 parts, and Part 1 is called Commodification and Sensible Economy. And all of these pieces involve a translation of an object into a quantity of gold, and the rest of the piece made out of plaster. And I kind of saw the plaster as sort of a ghost, a part of the piece that sort of exists for you to fill in the blanks, but it is there and it isn't there, and at some point in time it won't be there. It will probably disintegrate and you'll just be left with this little part. I'm not rushing that, though, but I would assume at some part it probably will happen. This one's a gun, a small semi-automatic handgun. Again, I think the price of the gun was about $200. It's kind of a little lady's gun. And all of these pieces have little plaques that go with them that actually document the calculations. This is the value of the object. This is the day I started it. This was the London PM fixed rate on gold on that day. And it ends up telling me that I need to put 0.7 ounces, troy ounces of gold in that piece. So each of these pieces has calculations on these laser-etched plaques. So I saw it as, these kind of plaques that suggested a kind of truth etched in stone, yet the truth that I was expressing was a truth that was only true on one day in history, a relationship, a prototype, and an image that only had meaning at one day, one moment in history. A book. This one was done a slightly different way than all of the others, simply because I had to do some experimentation. I wanted to be able to pick up the ink on a 40-year-old hardcover book. And so I found a way of making a mold that would pick up leftover ink residue and deposit it on the plaster casting. Rhinoplasty, cost of a nose job. There's a lot of gold in this one. Cell phone. This one I actually used the value of, I think it was like a year's worth of cell phone service. So it wasn't the cost of the cell phone, but the cell phone was more symbolic. This is the only one that has no plaster in it, and the reason is that this was the value of a half-carat Tiffany engagement ring, and this was the only object in which its value exceeded the size that I had to work with. So not only did I not have room once I made the whole ring out of gold to get all that gold in it, because gold was only $300 an ounce when I was making these pieces, but the ring is about this big, and it hangs from a long chain. And then I decided, oh heck, I needed to get so much gold in it, I'd make it kind of like a penis ring, since I thought Tiffany engagement rings were really kind of about men strutting their stuff anyway. So here is my violin. Interesting story here. I really wanted to make a mold of my violin, which cost me a few $1,000s, and I didn't particularly want to ruin my instrument. So, as we all have done, and there are even commercials on TV about this now, one day I just went into Google and put in making a mold of a violin. And sure enough, I came up with an article written by a famous violin maker in Cremona, Italy, who had made rubber molds of Stradivariuses and Guarneri's when they were in the shop for repair, and then these molds would be used for teaching purposes. And I sent an email to this guy in Italy, and wouldn't you know it, I got a call back from him later that day, and he told me how I could make a mold of my violin. The instrument had to be taken apart, and he knew of a very special kind of rubber that could be used. And so we indeed did make a mold of the instrument. And so this has a lot of gold in it also, both on the scroll and the hair of the bow. And that violin bow, a plaster violin bow, is the most difficult thing I have ever made in my career. I think when I get my mind set on something, I don't care how long it takes me to do it. And I think I spent 6 months trying to make a violin bow. I must have tried 30 times to do it, and every time I pulled it out of the mold, it would break. And I just kept trying different ideas, and finally I got it to work. But the reason that I got it to work was that what I had to do was take another violin bow and cut it in pieces and re-glue it back together, the shape that a bow is when you actually tighten the hair on the bow. Because when you tighten the hair on the bow, the arc changes, and that was the problem that I was having in the making of the bow, and then finally that worked. Ridiculous amount of time. Everybody was saying, give up on the bow, you don't need the bow. But for me, a violin without a bow is, you can't play it. Computer, and this of course dates itself, a Mac G4 computer. This one is the only piece that has, on the violin that also has two pieces of gold in it, one on the apple, I couldn't resist the golden apple, and on the mouse. Shoes, these were my shoes, most expensive pair of shoes I ever bought. I bought them in Italy. I wore them for years. At the time when I bought them, they were $350, and that was about almost 20 years ago. I had an opening at Gallery Ra in Amsterdam. I had sold a bunch of pieces, and I promptly went to Italy and bought the most expensive pair of shoes I ever owned. Vacuum cleaner. One of the things that was important to me was to express the whole panoply of the kinds of objects and commodities that exist in contemporary culture. And so I wanted, for instance, things like the violin that have not changed, the design has not changed since like the 15th century, so it would be impossible to date a violin if you were to dig it up now and you didn't know how old it was and you just saw a plaster violin, to things that you might have to buy in a second-hand store, like an old Hoover vacuum like that, to things like a computer, a Mac G4 that dates itself very precisely in a period of maybe 3 or 4 years, that had to come from that exact time period. So I was sort of interested in objects that were dateable and weren't dateable within a given period of time. So this vacuum cleaner only had $19.99 worth of gold that I could put in it, since I got it at a thrift store, second-hand store. And the only thing I could think of on there that would really date it, if everything else fell apart on the vacuum, all the plaster and only the gold remained, was that fantastic embossed plastic vacuum cleaner bag that they used to make that had a texture like fabric on it. So that's where I put the gold. $100 bill with $100 worth of gold, very, very thin. The gold is as thin exactly as a $100 bill. And of course, this was also when gold was only probably $350 an ounce. Imagine how small that section would be now. Zoloft. The price of 6 months of Zoloft if you don't have health insurance. Starbucks coffee, you all know what that is, don't you, here in Seattle? This was my intake of Starbucks coffee in a month. 2 pounds a week. Now, I use that in my studio and at home, but still, that was a lot of coffee. I don't drink that much now because I quit smoking. A dozen long stem roses sent to somebody on Valentine's Day. And I can tell you, plaster roses aren't easy to make either. They took a lot of time to figure out how to do plaster roses. I actually used real long stem roses, but just covering them with plaster didn't work. So I had to go through a bit of a process to get the roses to work. I almost gave up on them also, but eventually I got it. And interestingly, when I made this piece, I didn't know that I would quit smoking, but I smoked for 40 years, 2.5 packs a day, and I just quit 3 months ago. But thank you very much. Any other accomplishment that I have in my life pales compared to that one. So that was my gold cigarette that corresponded to what I think it's 1 month of cigarettes. I hope it wasn't 1 week of cigarettes, but it could have been with me. I think it was a month of cigarettes produced a gold cigarette. Okay, then came part 2 of the gold standard. Part 1 had about 20 pieces, has about 20 pieces. Part 2 involved the fact that over a year's time I decided to buy gold from people. The price of gold was going up, and so I played around with putting a bunch of posters around campus, ads in the paper. I actually went to like antique stores and kind of antique jewelry stores and asked if they had any like old broken stuff they would sell me. Sometimes I got stuff for free from people who just left it in my mailbox at school. But over a year's time, I bought gold. I only paid the market price of the gold. I only wanted pieces that were in some way damaged and could be melted down. And I had the idea that eventually all this gold would be melted down and I would use it as part of my project. But I also felt a kind of need to express, number one, this sort of idea of the recyclability of the material, but also the sort of notion that gold objects tend to be very deep and sentimental meaning, and that I wanted to kind of capture that. And then I also was interested in the way gold would look without the gold. So all of those things came together for part 2 of the project, which I called Phenomenology and Substantialism. And I ended up taking the gold from each person that I bought, keeping those lots separate. So sometimes it was 1 piece, sometimes it was 20 pieces I bought from an individual person, documenting the price of gold on that day, how much I paid them for the gold, and then taking the actual gold jewelry, making molds of it, and casting these plaster tablets, not unlike something you might see in a natural history museum, that documented the gold. There's about 30 of these now, and the labels were actually typed with a really, really old vintage typewriter, the kind of one of those black ones where the keys are really high. And the idea was that I actually wanted these to look somewhat like old natural history displays. Part of what I was dealing with in the body of work was the notion of exploring the institutionalization of art and how we have categorized objects. I think we forget sometimes that art museums is a relatively modern phenomenon. I mean, we've only had art museums for maybe 150 years, and there was a whole history of art before there were art museums. And when art museums were first founded, the idea of them was to preserve objects from the past. Nobody ever imagined that we'd end up in the early 21st century with the phenomenon that works of art actually went straight from artist studios into museums and didn't have any other life other than that. And that has very much affected the kind of art that's been produced in the late 20th and early 21st century. And so exploring the notion of displays and the didactics that often accompany works of art became something that was very much part of this body of work for me. So that was a Swiss watch. This person sold me 12 bangle bracelets, which she said in the 1960s she wore them all together on one arm, and we can all sort of imagine that skinny little wrist with 12 bangle bracelets on there. Some little charms from somebody that said that their parents owned a jewelry store or grandparents owned a jewelry store in the 1950s in New York City, and this was like leftover stock. People are getting rid of this stuff, and for just a little bit of money. These are a watch fob and a little plaque, 24 karat gold, that somebody that belonged to a Navy admiral who died, and this was part of his estate, and the person just came to me and said, if you don't buy it, I'm going to just melt it down. So it seemed like a crime, but at least it got documented. So these were things that were given to this guy during World War I. They're dated like 1924, both of them. Just some assorted jewelry. I call that necklace the modernist necklace because it was a really weird little necklace. One of the things that was sort of important to me in these particular pieces was to keep this rough edge of the tablets. So they did have a kind of, you were very conscious of the fact that I had molded something. This was not about fooling you into thinking this was the real thing. This was about you being very conscious that this was a mold of something else. And so there's a whole bunch of assorted ones. I always left a little fragment of gold behind the glass where the label was, as sort of some evidence of this past life of objects that were no longer going to exist. That was an Israeli coin. Person said, there's little anecdotes written on the labels. Person said they bought it on their first trip to Israel in 1975. Little rings left in my mail. One of them was left in my mailbox with just a little note anonymously that said, for your project. I would often get little things like that. I sometimes got them in the mail, too. This is probably the most interesting piece of gold that I bought. This was 5.9 ounces of pure gold. And I bought this after gold had reached $1,000 an ounce. But I couldn't resist it. The University of Wisconsin, which has such amazing stuff on campus, actually has something called a physical sciences laboratory where they build large-scale scientific instruments. They build the kinds of things that are used by NASA and are used up in the North Pole to test the Earth's crust or atmospheric stuff or whatever, these giant things. And believe it or not, when the price of gold went so high, they had built this satellite that went up into space, and all the electrical circuits in the satellite, because it was going to be up in space for a certain amount of time, had to be made out of pure gold. And when they were building the thing, they had all the little cutoffs of the pure gold from the wires for the connections. And when the price of gold went up, they melted all those little cut-ups into an ingot and decided to try to sell them. So I bought them. And that's the hunk of gold I bought from them, and that hunk of gold kept me busy probably for more than a year. It would cost me like $6,000. Okay, then I went into part 3 of the body of work, which is where I'm at right now. And that part is called phenomenology, that part is called transubstantiation and the historicized object. And these pieces are all made out of all that gold I collected over a year's time, and I bought from people. I melted it all down. I realloyed it, returned it into sheet and wire and whatever I needed. I was lucky because there was a lot of things that I bought that were 14-karat gold, but I also had coins that were 24-karat gold and other things that were 24-karat gold that I had bought, so I could keep alloying it into whatever carat I wanted to use. I had enough of a selection. I didn't buy anything that was below 12 karat from anybody. And so I took this recycled gold and I sort of started producing these pieces that were really a recycled history. And sort of imagining pieces of jewelry that may have been made at certain periods in history, a sort of rewriting history with this recycled gold, so to speak. And this was the first one that I did. And again, these pieces also have a labeling system, but now the labeling system is done in my handwriting with pencil. So, in a way, it's kind of this sort of ultimate statement about the unreliability of labeling systems in general. This one is called Military Brooch, 1940. I think you can read the text. It says, marked on back for R.H., attributed to the Polish goldsmith Ilse Gralnick, who was later executed at Auschwitz. Believed to have belonged to Rudolf Haas, who was recovered from a farm in Poland in 1971, 24 years after the Nuremberg trials. So this is a piece that sort of refers to my own history. And, of course, Ilse Gralnick is my own name jumbled. There's an interesting sort of caveat about this piece when I made it that I didn't know, which was not long after I made it, I got a call from the Jewish Museum in New York who was interested in the piece. And I don't know where they had heard about it, but anyways, the curator at the Jewish Museum told me that there actually were pieces of jewelry. They have two of them in the collection of the Jewish Museum in New York, two pieces of jewelry that were actually commissioned by Nazis to be made by prisoners, by Jewish goldsmiths who were prisoners in concentration camps. So you can't make this shit up, is the moral of the story. Of course, theirs weren't made from teeth, but they certainly could have been. This one is called Victorian Chastity Belt Necklace. And of course, it is indeed based on the design of a medieval 15th century Italian chastity belt. There was sort of an odd obsession with sexual repression during the Victorian period, but then there was a whole other side of the coin, which was the kind of blossoming of interest in the biological sciences and the study of nature and the study of insects and butterflies and the drawing and rendering of all the creatures on Earth. And so there was this odd sort of dialectic going on between a period in history that could easily be considered one of the most visceral periods in history, and then this incredible repression of women. And I'll read you what it says on the text on this one. Victorian chastity belt necklace, circa 1879, based on a 15th century Italian chastity belt. Recent DNA testing reveals the hair to be from a man's beard and head. This piece, unfortunately, doesn't read so great in slide because it's very large. It's about 6 feet high, and it's called hair noose, and it's actually completely made from fragments of human hair, fragments of Victorian hair work that was all sort of damaged pieces of hair work from watch fobs. That were used as men's watch fobs in the Victorian period, and I sort of turned them into this noose that you could hang yourself with. And then there's a completely silly gold tassel hanging at the bottom. This one is called tool, medical device, tool, instrument, or medical device. And it's dated as circa 1900 AD to 2400 BC. Provenance unknown. So it's just one of those weird things. I just love when you go to like historical museums and they have all this weird stuff, and they sort of suggest that it might have been used for this and it might have been used for that. And I imagine this person sitting in a little office somewhere saying, let's see, what am I going to write on that label, since we really don't have a clue what this thing was. But I collect medical instruments. I have a collection of surgical instruments, scientific instruments in general, antique microscopes, surgical instruments, medical atomizers. So in a way, that piece is a conglomeration of my entire collection. This piece is called Fringe Necklace with Ball and Chain. The fringe necklace part is sort of based on a well-known piece of jewelry that was considered part of the famed Troy treasure. Then the assumption is that this chain, this ball and chain, has been added onto it later. The text reads, fringe necklace circa 2600 BC, part of the famed Troy treasure, excavated in 1879 by Heinrich Schliemann and sold to Germany, later stolen by the Russians at the end of World War II. And then the ball and chain with flags, probably mid to late 20th century, fabricated by an anonymous Russian goldsmith, hello, and commissioned by a wealthy American industrialist. And there's the close-up of it with the little cloisonné flags, because this whole Troy treasure was such an interesting prototype of the history of objects and how they have moved around in terms of different countries claiming them, and because of course, you know, where this was excavated is Greece now, so Greece thinks they own it. You know, the Germans stole it, so they think it's theirs. Then the Russians stole it, and they think it's theirs. And I think it's sort of interesting that the provenance of the piece and its importance becomes completely lost with all these people like hanging labels off of it. This piece is called Coin Collection Picture Gallery. And in this case, what I did was, some of what I wanted to do in this body of work was to imagine the multitudes of the kinds of objects that exist in museums and even exist in the field of metalsmithing specifically. So I wanted to think about objects that might be made by great craftsmen or great artists, but also objects that might be made by some dilettante who is or hobbyist who was sitting home making something. And so in this case, I imagined somebody having a coin collection that they may have collected from their travels, and then the coins themselves, which are from all different periods in history and all over the world, were then molded and cast into gold. None of these were actually gold coins. And just the frames of the coins were taken, because I like to sort of play on the idea of the history of gold frames, framing paintings. And so I took little coins and turned them into frames, and then I made little paintings, little egg tempera and gouache paintings behind glass in these coins. And Coin Collection Picture Gallery, difficult to date, appears to have been started in the late 19th century and worked on for 50 years. Many of the paintings seem to be variations on historical designs, and the frames are exact replicas in gold of coins from around the world. Artist is unknown. And all of the coins, all of the original coins are in like a little drawer underneath. And these are these little tiny paintings that I painted under magnification, and they are indeed all based on historical designs. And then we come to the last piece I have. I was on sabbatical, and I traveled to Spain while I was on sabbatical. And one of the things you can't help, especially if you're in Andalusia, you can't help being totally moved by this sort of cultural confluence that exists in that part of the world, where basically all of the artwork and designs becomes this becomes this amalgam of Christian, Jewish, and Islamic designs. And so I decided I was going to play with that in a piece. And so what you're looking at on the left is actually not Spanish. It's probably the most famous Madonna and Child, Giotto's Madonna and Child. It's certainly my favorite one. And then on the right is the Alhambra. And then underneath the Alhambra is text written on the wall of the most ancient synagogue in Spain, in Cordoba, Spain. And one of the things that's kind of interesting when you're traveling in that part of Spain is these magnificent, the money that has been spent to preserve these magnificent churches and cathedrals and mosques. And then you go to the one synagogue in what they call the Juderia, the Jewish section of Cordoba, and there is a section that's been preserved that's about the size of a closet. And that was what was scribbled on the wall. I took that text, I took a photograph of it. I brought it back home. I found that's ancient Hebrew script. I found at my school a expert in ancient Hebrew script, which is actually more Arabic than it is Hebrew. And she transcribed it for me because a lot of it was chipped, and I wanted to make sure I got the characters right. And I used it in my piece, which is a halo. So I imagined, after you look at all that Byzantine and Romanesque painting when you're in Spain, I keep thinking, that halo, where did that gold halo come from? It's like it really must have existed because it's in all these paintings. So I imagined that there really was a gold halo, and that it actually was two-dimensional, since that's the way it is in the paintings. And I actually used the portrait of Giotto's baby Jesus, and made my halo based on that profile, and decorated the whole thing with sort of Islamic decoration, and then on the rim of it is this Hebrew text that sort of announces the founding of this first synagogue in Spain. And then finally there are these little grisaille enamels stuck in that are my fingerprint. So in a way, it became this just total interpretation of history through the eyes of the present moment, which I think in a way encapsulates what the whole body of work is about. So I'm still working on these pieces. There's a few more pieces coming from this last part, but they're not done yet. There'll be a few more new ones at the show at the Bellevue. And that's it. That's pretty much what I've got. If anybody's got any questions, I'd be absolutely happy to answer them. I don't know if I went over my time or didn't use my...
a few minutes for that before we take a break.
Any questions?
Right here. How did you, if this is all gold, how did you do the darkening, like the patinaed part or the...
There's no patinaed part. That's basically open filigree. It's filigree or a sort of fabricated Moorish design. This is a box I built for displaying this, and I cut a section out so that you wouldn't see white behind those cutout areas. So what you're seeing is the dark from inside the box behind it. Yes, you can see through it. Yep. It's just a little illusionistic trick. Anybody else?
I just have one question, and that is, you mentioned that you're thinking around the concept of beauty has evolved, and as you've gotten older, it's shifted. Could you comment on that? That was intriguing.
She's asking about me mentioning that my concept of beauty has changed, and I think that a lot of times beauty is used in a lot of different ways and is used in conjunction with talking about ornamentation and decoration, and I think those things are very, very different. And so at this point in my development and my thinking, I think I've just kind of thrown beauty in the garbage as a non-issue for me in terms of my work. I think what I am interested in is objectness. I'm interested in craft, and I'm interested in making an object that is seductive and perhaps enigmatic, and I'm interested certainly in the phenomenology of the object, but to start deciding whether it's beautiful or not becomes very suspect to me. Certainly because in the late 20th, early 21st century, as Dave Hickey pointed out so perfectly in his essays on beauty, The Invisible Dragon, beauty is kind of the invisible dragon. It's kind of this issue that gets in the way, and if you just sort of forget about it and start thinking more about this sort of perfection of a concept to a material, to a making, to an object, so that it's all sort of in cahoots in a very precise way, and forget about whether it's beautiful or not. For me, it becomes a much clearer way to work, because I keep associating beauty with cliches, and any pure notion of beauty for me simply, as I said, is phenomenological, which means that I can't ever reproduce it anyways. Back there?
Yes. Have you or will you consider putting together this talk you just gave with these images so that we might be able to have it in a book?
Well, the Bellevue is producing a catalog for the exhibition, so for the gold standard, so there will indeed be a catalog with some essays, and I'm very grateful for that.
The dates for that?
I think the show's going to open at the museum on March 18th. The actual public opening will be March 25th. Nora's in the audience, so she can confirm that with me, but that does look like what the dates are going to